All right. Well, first and foremost, welcome everyone to our second IEEE-HKN Innovating the Future workshop, focusing on when you can identify that your project is mature enough for publication. My name's Joe Green. I'm a research engineer at GTRI and education chair for the Innovating the Future conference. And I'm thrilled today to bring with us Karen Panetta, who will be our speaker. We're first going to discuss the Innovating the Future conference a little bit more as a new initiative within IEEE-HKN, then turn it over to Karen as our wonderful speaker for the day. First and foremost, just for your awareness, Innovating the Future is HKN's first technical conference and is dedicated to showcasing pioneering work from students from around the world. The goal is to create a two-stage conference structure designed to help guide particularly new publishers through the publishing lifecycle. The first stage, which is concluded for this year, but we encourage you to take a look for next year for this opportunity, is when students submit an extended abstract. And if you're curious about writing abstracts, we did have our first workshop in this series specifically to this point. The abstracts are reviewed, and the accepted students are assigned an IEEE mentor to help develop their full papers. In phase two, the final papers are submitted, and accepted students are scheduled for in-person presentation at the Innovating the Future conference, which happens in conjunction with the IEEE HKN SLC Student Leadership Conference. To give you an outline of the timeline for this year's run of the show, as I mentioned, while the extended abstract deadline has passed for this year, we definitely encourage everyone in the audience and watching to participate in our future events, in particular these educational workshops designed to walk you through the publishing lifecycle. As I mentioned, we did hold our first workshop already. You can find that on the IEEE-HKN YouTube channel. We're holding our second workshop today, but we have 3 more throughout the course of the year to cover the rest of the important aspects of going through and writing a paper to presenting at a conference. If you are interested in being involved in the IEEE-HKN Innovating the Future conference, there's still a couple of opportunities, in particular for our professional members that might be watching from across IEEE. We are, first of all, still looking for mentors. If you're interested in taking those accepted students and helping them craft their extended abstract into a full paper, this is a wonderful opportunity to get involved and begin giving back to our emerging researchers in the next generation of engineers. In addition, we do need additional reviewers, in particular for that second review cycle when we're going to be judging the full papers themselves. If you're interested in either opportunity, I strongly encourage you to reach out to the team at info@hkn.org and get involved. And of course, if you're interested in engaging across IEEE-HKN or IEEE as a whole and other volunteering roles, I'm sure Karen can also mention, boy, we have work for you to do. So feel free to reach out at any point. But without further ado, move past this for the time being, I'd like to introduce our absolutely amazing speaker that we have today. To be able to discuss the maturity of publication, we have Dr. Karen Panetta. Dr. Panetta is a distinguished professor and dean of graduate education at the Tufts School of Engineering. She's also been an incredible volunteer within IEEE-HKN, recognized both as an academic by being an IEEE fellow, and also as just a stellar pillar of our community by instantiating a number of global initiatives, such as her Nerds Girl initiative. By falling within this intersection of volunteering excellence, academic excellence, and societal good, Karen Panetta was also the recipient of this year's IEEE Mildred Dresser-House Medal for contributions to computer vision and simulation algorithms and leadership in developing programs to promote STEM careers. We're honored to have her as our speaker today. And without further ado, I turn the floor over to Karen.
Oh, thank you, Joe. I appreciate what a warm welcome. Thank you so much. So I am about to bring up my slides here as soon as I can. There we go. Here we go. So welcome everybody. I am Karen Panetta and I'm really excited to be with you here today. I like this topic because we gather knowledge as we go along, but we never actually put it into presentations and we just give you bits and pieces. So today you're going to get some whole pieces so that you can take away and know what you're up against and what you need to do. And I think all the other workshops will dive into specific aspects of it, but I'm going to focus on today, like when you're ready and some of the things that you should be doing. So the first thing we have to talk about is, why do we even bother publishing? Now, if you're a PhD student or a master's student, the first thing you know is your advisor might say, you get to graduate when you have this many papers. And that might be daunting because you don't even know, where am I going to publish? How am I going to even draft a paper? Or, how am I even to do this? So there's many aspects that we'll talk about with respect to what is really publishing mean to in your environment. If you're a faculty member, most likely, tenure track faculty in academia have to show scholarly work, and to keep their job, then, the publisher perish type of mindset. But they also disseminate it so people get to know them and discover the work and maybe do some collaborations, which is kind of important. And then if you're in industry, why bother publishing if you're in industry? Well, you want to show how impressive your company is and you bring brand awareness and show that you're leaders in technology. But you might also want to train other people in your company to take over this work as well and attract new talent. So students find out, hey, I saw this product, I saw them do a presentation on the technology that went into this. I want to join that team. That sounds really cool. So that's why people typically publish. But let's talk about the real reasons we should publish. We definitely want to disseminate new approaches and build awareness and trust. Why trust? Because if we have scholarly publications that are based on data, based on experiments, and show that we've really done our due diligence developing the methodologies, that helps other people know that this is not something, some hand waving thing. This is actually something that other people can utilize. And we want you to disseminate your work, whether you could decide to go into academia or not. It's important you disseminate your work so others can discover you. It might be to find a job, or it might be able to work on a bigger challenge together. I'm always surprised when I work on things, people contact me and say, hey, you work on drones, you work on vision. Are you interested in elephants? And you're like, what? You have these crazy things, but then you realize, wow, my technology can help all these other fields, but they would have never known about what I was doing if I had not published. And then building collaborations to gain new perspectives. And that's an example. I never understood that my work could be really valuable in dentistry or in wildlife conservation or ocean exploration. I'm an electrical engineer. What does this got to do with all those different fields? My skills and competencies can help complement and help other people with their challenges. And then we need to keep learning, because if we want to keep ourselves marketable and keep our brains going, we really should continue to keep learning, lifelong learning. And that's what IEEE helps us do. So let's talk about, what does published mean? So your advisor, I'm going to take the perspective of your advisor. They say you need to publish, and usually that means you have to publish before you graduate. Well, publications can take a long time. And the question is, where should you be publishing? There's conferences, which usually happen, have a submission process, and then you physically have to show up regardless of where they are in the world, unless it's hybrid. There's journals, which doesn't require you have to show up anywhere, but you have to prepare your manuscript and takes usually a longer review time. There's workshops and symposiums, which a lot of people really don't think about, but they're good places for when you want to discuss and have other people to really collaborate with and give you nice feedback. I found that one of the first workshops, IEEE workshops I ever went to, was the North Atlantic Test Workshop. I was doing semiconductor testing, and they were wonderful because I was a young, new faculty member. I was doing this research, and you wanted to hear these perspectives. And rather than just publishing or getting feedback from reviewers, they would talk to you about like human beings rather than just, no, you're rejected. And it actually was helpful because you got to connect with other people and say, well, I like this piece. Maybe if I added my piece, we could do something together. And that's how I built my research collaborations. Magazines are also another way. We even have the Bridge magazine, and we also have other magazines that are out there within the technical societies. So when you're thinking about publishing, you really would have to work out with your advisor what's acceptable to them, because you don't want to spend all this effort going to a workshop or a magazine and have them say, oh, no, that doesn't count. That's not what I meant. And so be careful about that. But what does it mean to your advisor when you say you have publications? Well, you can submit a manuscript. Does that count? Or does it have to be accepted with revisions? And usually an advisor might say, you don't get to graduate until you finish those revisions and I have to sign off and it's the final manuscript. If it's all completed, that's submitted, maybe they let you go. But some of them might say, nope, I need to see it in print. I need it published. It's got to be really, really done. That's adding a lot of time. So you need to know up front where you're going to think about this. The other thing is everything today, if faculty can afford to, I make everything open source. The reason to do that is that you're getting a much broader audience to see your information, but I also feel that it's great because places that don't have resources get to see your work as well. So I like to share my work as broadly as possible, and sometimes there's funding through your institutions to do that because they want to promote your work. Archive and GitHub are another types of examples where you can pre-publish your data sets, your journals. And one of the reasons to do this is because the review cycles are so long. I have a paper, I won't mention the journal or the publication area, but I've been waiting 10 months. You wait 10 months, which means you can't submit that work anywhere else. So what we do is we put it on archive while we're waiting for our reviews to come back. And meanwhile, other people are seeing it, which is great. Poster versus oral presentation. Doing posters at conferences, usually you get a lot of interaction and you also get a lot of feedback. Some advisors don't like that. They really say, no, it has to be an oral presentation. It has to be in IEEE Explore. So these are all questions you should be asking, because if you go down a path and you invest in all your energy and it's not going to help you achieve what the expectations are of your institution, that's another thing. If you're in industry, you also have to make sure that there's lead time, because industry wants to make sure you're not giving away intellectual property or private code or something that they could make money on. So those require lead times, because you might have a conference deadline, and if you try to give it to your company to sign off on, and they'll say, well, we need 2 weeks to review this, you'll miss the deadline. You will not be able to submit that paper. So think about these things as you do it. So I want to give you an example of what a trend that I don't like. There's in some of these conferences now, there's some really select high profile conferences with 17 to 25,000 paper submissions, and they accept around 60 papers. Now that's, if you think about it, crazy, right? It's like hitting the lottery. If you do get your paper accepted, it's really, like, oh, I got this, less than 1% get accepted, and people might think you're super impressive, and that's fine, and you can do that. But you also have to remember that you're waiting and holding on to your work for 6 to 9 months for a review to come back, and you're not allowed to submit it anywhere else. So while you're doing that, from the outside perspective, someone might say, oh, wait a minute, you haven't published any papers this year. But you might say, well, I submitted to these 2 conferences, but they turnaround time and the acceptance rate was so ridiculous that, I think it's a waste. So I'm going to say, if you want to do these things, that's fine, but just be prepared that it's like hitting the lottery. And the reason I say this is, if you're not successful, if your paper does not get accepted, you don't want it to be used as, oh, nobody's interested in your work because you got rejected from this ridiculous conference that only 60 papers get in. That's crazy. And I don't want you to think that because you went for this very, very highly competitive conference, that your paper was no good. Really what happens is, if you think about it, how many reviewers do you think you need to review 25,000 paper submissions? And do you really think that they're going to get high quality reviews? The answer is probably no. I find that when I submit to IEEE journals and magazines or conferences, I don't get AI generated comments back. I get real substantial, meaty comments back, which is really helpful because I know how to revise them. When you get these I call them rando generated submission feedback from these other conferences, you'll usually sit there and scratch your head like, did they even read my paper? This isn't even, so I can't, and if you try to make them happy by changing your paper, it doesn't make sense. So I really want to make sure you understand that while everybody wants the most competitive journals and publications, your goal is to disseminate your work. And if you're proud of it, and it's going to an IEEE conference, that's prestige right there. And I have this little cartoon that says most sites, this is how, papers are accepted. Right? You're going to get some nasty, nasty reviews. And we have, a whole session on how to deal with that. I have my own way to deal with it. When I get a rejection, and yes, I do get rejections. And when I get them, I don't open them. I give it to my students first. And then I make them tell me, like, okay, before I read them, I make my students tell me, did they actually have any good points? And then we discuss what we could improve. And then after we cover strategy, then I'll go back and I'll read them. And most of the times my students will come back and say, if it's an IEEE journal, yeah, they gave us some really good feedback and we can revise and resubmit. And other times they'll say, this was AI generated. It was like, it was so random. It looked like it was hallucinating. They had no clue what we were doing. And essentially we wasted our time with even trying to, you can't appease those types of reviewers. So that's what I do. So that way I go through the 7 stages of anger, sadness, and then I come back in with a vengeance to fight. So everybody goes through it, and failure is part of the process, and we all deal with it differently. So let's go to the next one. So what's my takeaway from conferences, journals, publications? So what's the famous line from Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade? I don't know if anybody ever saw that movie, but this was the Holy Grail. And Indiana Jones is in this cave with this old knight, and there's all these cups, and he has to drink from them. And he says, if you drink from the right one, you get immortality. You drink from any of the wrong ones, you die. So he ends up saying, choose wisely. So that's why if you put some thought into where you're going to publish and the turnaround time to get feedback and if you're ready to present, whether you're okay with an oral presentation, whether you're okay with a poster presentation, and you consider all these factors rather than, oh, this deadline's coming up, let me just throw this paper in here because that's the next deadline, you will choose wisely and you'll have much better success. So let's talk about the timeline. So you prepare your manuscript, you submit it somewhere. And I have this, this lady in here, and it's like you go in young and you wait and you get gray hair waiting. And then you get decision and you're like, oh, then you might have to, if you're lucky, you get to revise and resubmit. And then you wait and you wait and you wait. And essentially you end up praying that something happens and you get some good feedback. A lot of new conferences will have this rebuttal period where you can put in a rebuttal. Again, I won't tell you not to do that, but I'm telling you it's very, very, very rare that if you've had any rejected paper and you put in these rebuttals, I especially when there's 17,000 to 35,000 papers, it's very rare that it's so compelling that they're going to overturn the decision. So it's up to you to extract what you think is useful out of those constructive feedback. If you have it, then I would suggest you take it and you use it wisely to go somewhere else. So what kind of work can you publish? When are you ready? Well, there's different types of work. One of the biggest challenges I see for young faculty members or postdocs is they come out and they said, well, I don't know what I can publish because I just started, but I want to jump right in and publishing. And usually it takes about a year of effort to work on something before you have some sort of meat to actually publish. But there's different ways you can publish even if you don't have a lot of results yet. And one of them is comparative studies. So it's sort of like looking at a body of work over time to be able to help people summarize, not a large language model tell me about all these different things, but more of your looking at different types of methods and being able to run some of your own experiments. Say, I implemented someone else's method. I implemented this method, with this new kind of data or for this new kind of situation, and this is what happened. So you're utilizing previous work to compare and be able to do some of these comparisons and introducing your own perceptions or your own experiments of it. So that's a comparative study, usually on looking at different approaches. You might say, for the longest time, AI has used these concurrent neural networks as quaternions better. Let's see what's out there and run some experiments and try to answer that question. That's absolutely a valid type of publication. The other one is reviewing current state of the art, again, what they call review papers. And again, this is looking at across the landscape of the history of something, but also looking at where we are today with it and some of the challenges, and maybe looking at proposing maybe a combination. So maybe you modify some of the algorithms just to demonstrate here's the state of the art. And I think that if we merged this and took the best advantages of that and we put it together, we get better results. And maybe you do some pilot study and you actually do it, and write some algorithms or do some experiments and you show that. But the body of the work is really showing that you know the whole landscape very well and what people should take away. What are the pros of one approach versus the other? And being able to show this one's really good, very fast, but totally not explainable, not good for applications in this type of area. So that's another one. The most popular one, if you're in academia, is probably new research exploration. So this is where you're coming up with your new research. So when you're looking at new research, this is probably the one that takes the longest because you really do need results. So let's go to the next one. So I mentioned comparative studies, pros and cons of methods, offer insight into future directions. And then again, you have to show some experiments. You can't just talk about it or you're just giving a history lesson. You have to be able to make some, conclusions and be able to propose something new, even if you haven't fully explored it. And then review papers. I like review papers because they help me figure out where things are and what I should look at. So this is an example that I'm showing of, it's like heart, different types of things in the heart imaging and different methodologies. And it shows you a timeline of what the different algorithms are for looking for aerial stenosis in hearts and veins and things like that in the heart and the left ventricle. So it's showing you these different types of things and being able to show, here's the latest algorithms, and maybe looking at these evolutions and saying, you know what, I like 3D, but I really like that this one added new features or has new measurements, quantitative measurements, where before you couldn't do that. Let's combine those and see what happens. And you run some experiments. Even though it's not your algorithms, the fact that you're using them in new ways or look to combine them in new ways is actually very valuable. Let's talk about the paper. So now you know where you want to go. You picked a conference, you know your deadlines, you know what kind of paper you want to do, whether it's going to be comparative study or research. You do your abstract. So your abstract, we had a whole session on that, and I hope you can review that, but I'll talk a little bit about now. So an abstract, you really should be able to convey what the thrust of your paper is. Like, why am I even writing this? And give enough background of how your work fits in and why it's important. Well, this is not a history lesson in the introduction. And most people, failures I see in the paper, spend more time in the introduction and background section than they do introducing their own methodologies and their experiments. The meat of your paper should really have enough background introduction, but you really want to impress your audience with, here's my methodology, here's the things I explored, here's what the experiments we conducted, and here's the insights we're going to make. So the methodology is really heavily weighted because it's got to show that's where you're making impact. You can have a beautiful introduction, but if you don't have the follow-up meat to show that you've actually done something good, you've got a paper that's a nice essay on some technology. Results are probably very, very important, not just to have them, but how you explain them. So they're going to show different aspects of the experiments, and they have to give meaningful insights. And I'll talk about some bad ways to present results that are coming up. And then conclusions, there's takeaways. There's takeaways from your talk you want people to have. And I'll talk about, again, bad conclusions, what people do that I see. So the first thing I want to say is every word is precious. If I were going to charge you, like I'm an editor-in-chief at WIE Magazine, I pay my reporters by the word, which means if they're going to go write an article and I'm paying by the word, I want to make sure every piece of that article is informative and not repetitive and useful. So unfortunately, if I said to you, you've got 5 pages for this paper, you need to be lean, mean, and very concise, and you don't want to be repeating yourself. So think about if you were to pay money, would you waste money repeating yourself or reporting the same thing? And the answer is probably no. If they charge you per word and said, you're going to pay per word for every word you put down, you are going to make sure you have the tightest paper possible. So I want you to remember that. And this comes into play, especially when people do the abstracts. They try to give these elaborate promises to make people be all impressed with their abstract. And notice I gave an example. I call it new efficient AMM models for heart transplant operations. I totally made that up. If you actually search and there's a paper on there, I put in this disclaimer that this is not a real paper, or at least if it is, I apologize because that's not what I meant. I'm trying to show an example that if I say I'm going to do something, and this is the title, and then my abstract also says, yes, we're going to look at heart transplants and these are AI models. And then in my paper, I don't really do anything for heart operations. I just say here and then say it's in the future work. That's a death sentence. That's an immediate death sentence because it's like you made false promises that you were going to talk about this and you didn't give any evidence that you really could do it. So the other thing I see people do is they jump right in with technical formulas and jargon, assuming that the audience knows why this is important and what you're going to talk about. And that's really hard to swallow too. The abstract should match the flow of your paper. In this paper, we're going to talk about this new algorithm that's going to achieve this and this by these methods, which we're going to introduce that are new because, or novel because of this. And then we're going to present the results. And that's the way your paper should flow. So if you just say, well, I'm going to talk, here's the introduction and just repeat the section headings, that's not really informative. The other one is the big one when people are reading your paper, especially research papers. Why is what you're doing important? But more of all, they're looking for novelty, especially for PhD students. What's so novel about it? And in comparative studies, it might not be novel in the work that was done, but it might be novel in the way, in perspective, you present how to combine it or how to use it for a different application. So make sure you call that out. That's important to be able to do that. The other one is, sometimes I read these abstracts and I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is boring. Why would I want to read it, even if it's in my topic area? Sometimes we have really dry topics that might be very boring, but if you can tie it to the biggest social impact or what the big impact is, this will, increase the computational speed or reduce millions of parameters in AI training or whatever it is you need to do. But don't make those claims unless they're substantiated. So be careful of overselling. So that's why I want to say don't mislead or exaggerate the work. And your abstract should be talking about what you did, I'm going to present what I did, not what I'm going to do in a year from now, and not what I'm going to do after I finish this work. And I see that a lot because this is not a proposal. This is publishing what work you have done. So the cartoon is showing, yes, I'm going to have these flying magic unicorns. I see lots of papers where over and over people promise things and that paper doesn't even talk about it. You might have one word in the future or the conclusions, and that's misleading. And people get angry with that and they'll just reject you outright. All right, so here's examples of when you're ready to publish. Do you have any new algorithms? Did you create any existing improvements over something that already exists? Did you use it in different ways? Maybe you used it for different applications, or you combine things that that no one has ever thought about doing for. Did you do it for different environments? I did my image processing for rainy days. Well, now I'm going to try underwater. Nobody's done that before, and be able to call that out. Did you design anything? A lot of things can be projects. A lot of you have created really nice projects, and that project can talk about the problem you were trying to solve and how you were going to design your system and what some of the different technologies you put together and how you solve some of those challenges at the interface boundaries. That's valid. A user study. A lot of user studies are very, very impactful, especially now for training AI models. Getting ground truth or human experiences from using types of technology or other types of things. So for instance, I know a lot of my students work with robotics and they want to see, I came up with this, robot algorithm. How do humans feel about it? Does it do the job? Sort of like evaluating chatbots. I don't know how many of you despise commercial chatbots, but I cannot stand, I want to talk to a human being. So every time I have to work with a chatbot, I'm saying, didn't anybody ever do a user study to see if people even want this or how they interact with it? Because every time I use them, they fail miserably. So that's something sometimes if you see something that doesn't work and you're asking yourself the question like, why hasn't anybody done this? That could be you. That could be you who does it and that you who gets cited. And then did you create a system that does something useful? I do a lot of different systems for detection and recognition for different applications across different disciplines. I work a lot with dental. I mentioned the wildlife. Maybe you're doing something that's kind of different on your senior capstone design project, or maybe your master's thesis. And then again, did you use existing technology but use it for a different discipline? Those are really cool. I've been publishing in dental journals and in nutrition journals. I'm not a nutritionist. I have bad eating habits, but I definitely work with experts in these fields, and I can assist with my AI technology and my experience to help them build better systems to get their jobs done and answer their research questions. So sometimes partnering with another discipline in using your skills and competencies as a science, technology, engineering a professional, you can bring something to light that they can't do by themselves. That's a great paper. So the other one is when you have results. Well, what do results look like? A lot of people will say, I have this cartoon, do you have any data that fits my theory? You have to construct the experiments to show or prove, disprove whatever you're working on, to show the performance improvements. Sometimes it could be computational. And sometimes people will, not show the failing ones. I can tell you right now, if yours performs better than everybody else's, or you're doing AI and you say, oh, I have 100% detection, things like it's 100% accurate, people question that. So sometimes in your tables, it's okay to highlight, here's all the cases we did best, and here's the cases that we didn't. But it shows an overall average improvement of this. That's okay. And people will respect you and trust you versus seeing that, look, we're the best, we're wonderful. I once had a student come in and show me results and said, our algorithm is better than anything out there. And I said, well, how many algorithms did you try? Well, 2. Sorry, that's not better than everything. So you need to be realistic about what you're doing. We want to show improvements, and what you're comparing to. You can't say my semiconductor device is way better than the previous work. And I was like, well, what previous work was it? Well, it was back when there was vacuum tubes and transistor tubes. You got to compare to relative technology. So make sure you're looking at the state of the art. The other one that I like to talk about is cognitive load on the user. A lot of the things, we're presenting lots and lots of data. We want to make sure that maybe we're doing something with eye tracking or being able to help users disseminate information. But maybe they're in stressful environments. Maybe you're looking at, this is a better interface that we designed. To put on this project, we designed a user interface so that people could better respond and get information faster and more informative without eye strain or without overload and cognitive load, because it's just inundated with so much information. The other one is a problem, solving a challenge. Is you pick a challenge, like our IEEE President's Challenge right now is out there, and it's looking at how to use technology to solve specific challenges. And maybe you have an idea that you want to implement to solve it. It might be using off-the-shelf custom things, or you're merging different ideas. That's a valuable results to show. And then the other one, sometimes nobody's ever done this before. If you actually come up with something that nobody's ever thought of before, no one's ever implemented before, don't publish it. Wait until you patent it. Because even though this isn't a patenting lesson, if you go and you publish something that was a great idea and you show people how to do it, and then you want to go patent it later, you've just disclosed it, you can't patent it. So you're throwing away potentially your future retirement. So be careful about that if you're gonna patent things. So you can be able to do all these different things, but you need some sort of results to talk about, some sort of experiments, some way to demonstrate that what you did shows the original intent of your abstract, that you've made progress. And I mentioned results should have meaningful outcomes. So, if I run something and say it failed on everything, well, did you learn anything from it? Maybe you could show, that, okay, these combinations of things don't work. But people typically want to see some form of success or promise. It might not work in all the cases, but you should have some meaningful outcomes. I'll give you an example of things that are not meaningful. Meaningful is when I show images and I say, mine is better. Why? Because I say so, or because visually it looks better to me. That's very subjective. And so quantitative metrics are really important. Some of my original contributions to this field of vision happen to be that answering that very problem was when I would read papers and people say mine's better because you can see it's visually better. And I'd say, well, a robot would never be able to say mine's better than that one. So I came up with a whole class of measures that figured out what human eyeballs think is better visually. And that's quantitative. So that was an example. But you should use quantitative results and metrics and benchmarks. And those benchmarks need to make sense for what the other papers that people published in your area, so that you're comparing to previous works, but using some of the same metrics so that you compare previous works to your work as well. Did you have an improved system? How do you show, is it throughput, response time? What metrics did you use? And then did you have a ground truth? If you're doing AI, you need data sets. Where did you get these data sets? Did you cite them? Did you use them? Did other people run the same experiments? Do you have things to create? Did you create your own data set? That's a wonderful way to publish. Create your own data sets with ground truths, annotated, labeled. IEEE has a whole new publication just for data sets. That is huge. And I would encourage you, if that's an easy way for you to start thinking about it. When I started doing my research, there were no data sets. So I was like, okay, I have to stop, create the data set, then I can answer my research questions. But little did I know that those data sets would be so impactful to other researchers as well. So I think that's cool. And then are you comparing to recent state of the art? Again, if you're not, people are going to pick up on that right away and say, well, you've missed 6 other recent works that really answered this question already, and you haven't compared to that. And it also shows that you are aware and that you've done your homework on what else was out there. So that's important, that you do know what else is out there. And before you go jump right into a research or paper, you should be asking that question. Has anybody else done that? And do that before you expend your energy doing it. Let's talk about how to make it engaging a little bit. I see so many papers where labels and keys and charts are not labeled, and you assume the reader is going to go dig into the text and find it. So the captions, I'll tell you how most reviewers review the paper. They go and they look at your figures, and they look at the captions and see if they can see if there's a story being told. They'll look at your references to make sure that the stuff is relevant, and then they'll go read the paper. So if you're expecting them to go dig out and figure out why this, table, what the results are, here's the performance, accuracy, recall, specificity, and whatever, and you just throw it out there and you throw it in a table, they're gonna be, well, which one was better? Under what conditions did this one come like this way? There should be a summary, even if it's a 1 or 2 line caption, that's fine. I find that much more useful. And that's the first thing I do when I review my students' papers, and I go right to the captions, and I'm saying, if I can't extract what you're doing in this paper through your results and what was meaningful from them, I make them rewrite it. So highlights in your tables are results versus others. Sometimes I'm like, we all come up with these weird acronyms and names. And I'm like, which one is ours? What do we call this thing? So that you highlight that this is ours, and then you highlight which ones gave the best performance. And if yours is not the one that's always the best performance, that's fine. It shows that you're realistic. And I always say use real quantifiable metrics. Again, this looks better is not good enough. You can't just say this one's better, or this one has this one metric that does better, because you have to compare and contrast. I had great recall, but I had terrible this. Well, what's the balance? Talk about the pros and the cons, or somehow looking and being able to give that insights. So here's examples. There's lots of websites out there to tell you how to do things, but I go crazy when I don't see axes labeled, and I don't see any keys and telling me what things mean. That's like my pet peeve, is like charts and labels and bar charts. What are you comparing to? What is the goal? So you're showing me this bar chart. What's it comparing? And what does it show me? What's the result of me looking at this data? It's showing me that here's the performance of these 5 methods, with over how many parameters the model took, how much CPU time it took, and look what you want. But they all achieved what kind of results? So be able to summarize that. Really important. Conclusions. Oh my gosh, conclusions. I can't tell you how many people I see copy the abstract into the conclusion. And remember, I started this talking about money. That's a waste of space, time, and everything. It should talk about takeaways. If you have any words that are repeating or sentences repeating, go back and rewrite it, because you're wasting that space. You want to say, this is what you should take away. We ran these experiments, and we now believe that you could do this, and that out of this, and this is the promising direction, and this is what we're going to do next. And again, that should tie into next, like next for us, not next in the 50 years from now when I retire. So the conclusion section, again, no repeats. And if you see repeats, it's going to stink, start over. And then the future directions should not be pie in the sky exaggerations that, okay, I proved it for these two algorithms and now it's going to work for everything else in the world and solve, world peace. If you figure that out for real, then you should have evidence that lends to that. And then again, you have to show enough evidence in your results. And you can't promise the world, at least not in 5 pages. So I have this little picture down here showing, and again, with AI now and deep fakes, we can make anything look the way we want. But here's this giant fish, and the fish is never that big. So make sure that you're honest about what you're doing and don't oversell. You want to be confident, but you also want to make sure that nobody's going to think that you're exaggerating. So that's that. And my conclusions for you, this is kind of weird, but I'm asking you to step away from your manuscript, give yourself a break. You will be reading this so many times that your brain will stop comprehending it. And sometimes all I'll do is I'll put it down. I will go for a walk. I will go out. I will change my mindset. I'll come back and I'll read it and I will be like, oh my God, what was I thinking? This makes no sense. It makes no sense. What was I thinking? So you're so close to it sometimes that you lose sight of it. And then the other one I usually tell my students is, well, you really want to publish in this crazy place that has 60 papers accepted. Look and see what they published and what you admire about them and try to emulate that structure. So, you can, that structure does not mean plagiarize. It means, how concise how they did the results. Maybe one of my papers, I loved the way they presented all their AI results and I created my own graphs emulating that type of thing. And then declare the use of AI responsibly. You're not using it. You can write AI. You can use AI to generate code for you to run your experiments, but declare it. But you're not going to have AI say, go do me a comparative paper on these 3 algorithms and give me some experiments and write the paper for me. That's a death sentence to your career. And finally, I think Dr. Green mentioned this in the beginning, become a reviewer yourself so you see more papers and see good practices. And remember, you want to give constructive feedback. You want to, and if you don't understand something, you can say, this paper didn't give me enough detail, but I also saw that the references weren't sufficient. But give good comments because think about the person that's reviewing your paper and if you were in their shoes, what you'd want them to say about your work. So with that, I do have my own lab. I do lots of research, everything mostly in imaging, but we do detection and recognition systems across all different types of fields. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. And someday when you get to present your work, you will get to go amazing places, meet amazing people, because the impact you make really does change lives, and it all can start with your publications. So thank you very much. Any questions?
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Karen. As always, it was an absolute joy listening to you, and I personally learned so much about contextualizing my research as an early career professional in the context of publishing. Taking a look, we don't have questions up just yet, so I'm going to encourage our chat to be able to go through and drop a couple. But that means you get to tolerate all of my questions for the time being. So I hope you're ready.
Sure, let's go for it.
But first and foremost, one of the aspects we think about when we think of academic publication is in the context of a academic career. So like working as a professor or a graduate student at a dedicated university. But it's also an important aspect for industry or even some of those in-between roles. Like I work for a government contractor in association with a university. So in these different contexts, let's say more of an academic career, an industry demonstration, or maybe even just to vet yourself to other outside sources. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of publication across these different fields and how they might be similar or differ?
Sure. So industry is most likely going to be working on some new process or product. And that's why they have to be careful about what they present. And you always see people from industry, they're not prolific publishers. And
Mhm.
most of the time is because they're protecting their intellectual property.
Sure.
Now, when I got to work at a computer, I was a computer architect, we came up with the world's first digital twin simulator. I'm the
Very.
co-inventor, right? And so when we published, we talked about some of our foundational algorithms, which then were used in other CAD companies as the foundation, and still are today. But it was interesting that at the time it was like, we don't want people to know we're doing this because our competitors will start to build the same thing. But this gets to a point where you get so far along, they're like, yeah, they can't emulate this because we've taken years to develop this. And but when we did it, it was groundbreaking when we did publish it, but we had already been using it for a long time. So that was one thing. And then we mentioned government. They have a longer lead time for what you can publish. And
Yes.
sometimes they have white papers and they might have their own internal symposium. So
Yes.
I see that a lot of time with companies. They have their own user group, customer groups, but they have their own symposiums in-house. And you get recognition for there, and you get to meet people all around your company as well as some of the leaders. So it's very valuable to do those because it gives you exposure to people who will be able to promote you, get you your next job, find out other groups. Hey, come work in my group. You're working on this. This is great. But I find that that's almost the best way to connect in your company to move up and have people know. So you're doing your own job in your office, your cubicle, your own boss knows you. But when you get in front of a symposium, all the company employees, the whole company knows you. So that's really important. That's I think that's a big one for people that they usually say, well, I'm in industry. I don't need IEEE. I don't need the publications because I'm in industry. I don't need it. Well, I guarantee you, every company has their own internal conferences. And if you want to shine, then you're going to publish your work and again, you can go all out and say exactly what you're working on because of you're talking to people in your company. So there's no protections that you have to worry about. So that's a big one. Academia is tough. It's a very, very harsh environment. I'd like to say it's not, but it is. It's very competitive. Thousands of applications to be a tenure track, but there's so many other opportunities for teaching track professors, professors of the practice.
Definitely.
Universities are eager for people that have been out in industry to come back and teach, even if they're doing it as an adjunct professor and part-time. But they really want people that know what, to help supervise projects. I want to call it the real world. I always tell people that, when I used to have a real job, my fellow academic people get upset with me because they say, what do you mean? What do you mean? But, I used to work in industry. I used to have to build products. I had real deadlines that if I didn't make these
Sure.
deadlines,
Definitely.
the product went down, people got laid off. In academia, it's like, yeah, my grant didn't got rejected. Okay, so I just move on. But I still get a paycheck because I'm teaching classes. It's a very different space. But working with academic advisors, we have our grad lab, right? We have a series of
Yes.
grad labs to talk about how to work with advisors. Every advisor is different. Some of them might say, nope, you can't publish in these IEEE places. I only want these other
Sure.
places. It's a constraint, and it really inhibits your graduation date, because if you can't graduate without a publication, that hurts. But that's why I think this innovation of the future conference is so important, because it's gone through a rigorous process of review, double blind reviews. No faculty member can say anything bad about it because it's rigorous, and it's probably just as rigorous as some of those other ones, except we are here to help make sure that the papers that got it, the abstracts that got accepted, are successful. And I think that that's something that's different, where everybody else expects you to stand on your own 2 feet, and unless your advisor's giving you that advice, you don't get to move on, right? So we are trying to be good advisors for those that may not have them, or for advisors that don't have time to be the great advisor that their students need.
I really appreciate that answer. And you touched upon a number of truly stellar points that I think are worth reinforcing, especially for early career professionals looking to publish. One, and we'll touch on some of the questions in the Q&A after this, that I'd love to get your take on is, especially for maybe some of our graduate students or prospective graduate students in the audience, there's a lot of perception that, if you're first paper doesn't get into Nature, or your paper or your project doesn't get into these top tier journals, you're an absolute failure from an academic perspective. But I would love to get your take on the reality of that situation. Like, as a graduate student, let's say, what should you be focusing on for your publications, and how can you be strategic with your publications so you can go from like the student conference we have to maybe some of those highly targeted or highly impactful results in your future?
And that's, I think you just answered it, Joe, because you said you jumping out of the gate and saying, I need to go to this, super competitive thing right from your first start, it's unrealistic. I think,
Yes.
it's and you're said almost like you're torturing yourself and saying yourself, unless you're just playing the lottery. If you want to play the
Yeah,
lottery,
for
then you
sure.
do that. But getting rejected hurts, right? And it's like, if and you're proud of your paper and your work, why not build up? So normally what I do is I always start when I have some new topic. It's very rare I jump right into a journal. I
Sure.
usually say, let's do the small aspects or the general aspects in smaller conferences, get the feedback, and then let's do more experiments. And once we've proven it, seen that people are interested and that we're making good progress, build it up to a journal paper. And then once I do a journal paper, normally it's like, okay, well, which journal do I want to put this in? And that's usually how I do it. It's very rare that I'll come up with something and say, let's go straight to, this highly competitive, outrageous, crazy conference. It's going to, waste a year of us waiting for a decision. Because that means that I can't do any, nobody knows I'm working on it. So that's why I really heavily utilize Archive and GitHub, share my data
Definitely.
sets,
For sure.
things like that, because it's like I'm waiting for, two people or three people in the universe of reviewers to make a, pass judgment on my career. Think about it, right? It's
Oh,
like,
yeah,
here's
for
the
sure.
limit. So I think that's important to know. So build up, the innovation of the future conference is a great start. And then after that, look at the other IEEE conferences and be able to start there, as well as the bridge. I think even publishing in the bridge is a great way to start, because it not only does it build your confidence, but if it got in there, think of the worldwide audience you're getting access to. And that alone, sometimes we need that boost to say, wow, I was good enough to have my stuff in this magazine, and they believe in me, and I got feedback from, you'd be so surprised, people read it and they give you feedback, and that's a win. When people respond to it, that's a win, and that's what you want. You don't want to put it out there and then say, nobody ever cited it, nobody ever gave me feedback.
Definitely. And I love that philosophy. And I think really strategically using archive as a mechanism is such a best practice. Like some of the best feedback I've ever gotten on my papers was putting a paper on archive and making a LinkedIn post about it. Now, all of a sudden, you get the unconstrained visibility you're looking for and some interesting feedback potentially from domains that might have not otherwise seen your work. So I love that answer. And I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to address it. And with that, let's jump over to the Q&A. I'm sorting the questions by number of upvotes here. The first one we have from Tyler, and he asks, how would you compare, if possible, the difference in getting work published for journals and conferences versus more commercial work like books available at the library/bookstore? Do you think the latter is valued in academia?
Writing a book takes a long time. Most of the things that I do, I did write a book, but that was more about my STEM outreach. But I think contributing to chapters is a way to be able to do that if you're going to do a book, or things like that. And then if you're teaching, sometimes people are teaching, and I will do sets of labs, and I'll create my own labs and problem sets and things like that. And if you can wrap around it, I ended up doing like this little, handout for students that ends up being an 80-page workbook, and you can self-publish or publish it. That's fine. But to go into it to say, I'm going to publish a book, that is probably not the direction I would recommend, because it depends what your goal is. Like if you already have accumulated all this information and you want to assemble it and put it as a book, that's one reason. So you have to think again. Remember, we talked about the motivation. Where do you want to go and why? So that's one. The second thing is, the journals again take a longer time. Conferences, they come up every year or whatever, and they have the expectation you're going to show up. So that's the other thing too. Is sometimes people think, well, I'll just get accepted in a conference and I won't go. That's not a good strategy. So if you don't have the money to travel somewhere, you're probably better off, or it's not hybrid, you're probably better off doing open source types of conferences or hybrid conferences, because you also have to register. So, you have to keep the cost in mind as well. And then the other one you asked about, journals. Journals are usually, again, I mentioned when I have real substantial results and I can say, here's the novel contributions, or here's what's new and different. And it's not just, one example, it's really a very robust results over, with ablation studies and things like that. that's when I'm like, okay, I am ready. And sometimes we get into writing a journal paper and my students were like, well, now I've got this, well, now I've got that. And I'm like, you've got to cut it off. That's another paper. So you might get multiple papers out of it. Conference is the same thing, right? Know when to stop. Like, okay, this is great. But if I try to put everything in the kitchen sink in there in one paper, you probably could have like 4 or 5 papers. So know when to stop and then say, okay, I'm going to cut this section out. I think that's a whole nother paper, and strategize that way. And that's what I do.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Next, we have a couple of questions from AJ, which seem to be focused around their experience as a system architect in industry. I will combine them a little bit here and dive into the aspects that might not necessarily be reflected. But in general, the bulk of the questions here have to do with trade-offs and how you present your literature and what becomes important as you go from an academic to necessarily an industry mindset in these publications. The first asks about how do you articulate architectural trade-offs and how necessarily is the importance in architecture when compared to the final result. And the next one has to do with the importance of reproducibility of your specific environment versus the logic itself, which maybe we could broaden to a bit more of a project level of reproducibility versus advancement in necessarily a
Right.
publication.
Right. A lot of these conferences now expect you to create a artifacts library
Mhm.
where you have the code, you have the data, and you have the scripts to run it to show that it actually runs. That's one of the big ones. So that's right there is they expect you to be able to upload everything. And that's where you get in trouble if you work in industry. Because if you work in industry, you're not giving them your code and you're not giving them your results, right? Or your IP. So you have to be careful there. So when you're in academia, if you're not going to patent it and you want to share your code, that's absolutely fine. And some of them require it. A lot of papers won't even accept it without the archive attached to it. So I think that that's one thing. The architectural one, I think is a good question because I was a CPU designer for many years. I had access to the latest and greatest designs, real designs. And then when I left industry and I came to academia, I no longer had access to those proprietary designs. So
Uh,
now I was stuck with whatever public domain, I don't want to say models or whatever that people would share. And I would open these models and I'd be like, oh my God, this is like grade school models compared to what I was working with. And
sure.
it made it really difficult to have impactful results because you didn't have access to the real meaty designs. So when you're making these architecture trade-offs, sometimes I see students who are interns for these companies and they can talk about architecture designs. The models, when we're talking about AI models rather than computer architecture, but AI models, those are pretty standard so that you can say, okay, here's a concurrent neural network, here's YOLO, here's whatever, here's diffusion network, the algorithm I used. And then you can compare and trust because it's such a wealth of already trained models out there. I use a lot of pre-trained models in my work because it's like, okay, I don't have 2 years to train a model. I'll use theirs and then I'll figure out, architecturally how I can modify or whatever, or, create additions onto that or something really cool that can make it do something it couldn't do before. But it's really important that you be able to articulate why you chose something versus this is the only one that was available. That's what, like when I got to places, I would say, this is the only models I had to work with, which was not good. But if you can say, here's all these models and here's why I picked this one over that one, and everybody else, everybody else was using this model, but nobody ever did it for compression before. So I'm going to use this model for compression that nobody's ever done. And here's the features about why this model is good for this application. And that's what we're going to talk about in this paper. That's absolutely a very compelling paper.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. And let's see, just because we're right about our 1 o'clock cutoff here, I have one more for you. I think an important aspect you touched upon is the importance of patenting your work and securing not just your research legacy, but your financial future as well. That's an aspect that, at least as a graduate student, wasn't necessarily overtly made aware to me. Can you talk a little bit more about when you might be able to recognize that a research project has the level of maturity, not just for an academic conversation, but when it might start filling this road to potentially consider patenting?
Sure. So when you go off and you start saying before you do your research and you say, who's done this, what else is out there, and you find that, wow, nobody's really ever put these pieces together before, and nobody's ever thought of using it for this type of application. Usually that means that you're onto something, but you have to validate that it's not there. You can do a search to see, has anybody ever done something in this? And that's how I start. My best ideas usually pop me out of bed at 2 in the morning, and I wake up
I can
and
appreciate
and I have to remember it, but it's like, why isn't it, why? And then usually, why hasn't anybody ever done this? And sometimes you might find they have, or you might think it's obvious and you should do it, or, and then you'll find, oh, wait a minute, it's got to be, um, non-obvious that you put these pieces together, or that, things like that. So normally I find if I come up with a great idea that I first find nobody else in the literature has even looked at, or this approach nobody's ever even thought of doing, that's usually my flag to look a little deeper before I go and I rush off to patent it. So I wanted to answer that, but I also wanted to mention, the last question, from AJ was about the reliability.
it.
And in your paper, honestly, it is good to say these were the challenges. It failed for these kinds of cases, or these corner cases. You can talk about that, or this is reliable under these conditions. That makes a big difference, because again, this builds trust with them as well, as a, types of things. But again, you only get a few lines on that. You might even put that somewhere in your caption to say, this outlines, there was 3 outliers that, the reason they failed was because there was no label data for this thing. And you can, or I couldn't do apples to apples with this comparison because the parser failed for these models because they really weren't compilable code. To be able to explain those, and you can usually do that in 1 or 2 lines. But if you're starting to go a whole section explaining why your stuff didn't work, then you really don't want to do that. You can do that in your thesis, but that just shows how many work you did. So that's it. So yeah, I hope that everybody found this useful.
Very much so. Thank you so much for your time, Karen. We do have our networking session after this. So if you'd like to come and speak with Karen or the HKN staff that has joined us as well, I encourage you to click on the scheduling tab in the top right of your screen and navigating to our networking fluid space. If you've not used the fluid space in AirMeets before, you have an avatar that you can move using your arrow keys around your screen. And as you get closer, it has a proximity chat feature. So feel free to join us in that space and enjoy and socialize. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your attention. Bye, everybody.